Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric Schmieder, and as TAA's Membership Marketing Manager and author or co author of several computer technology textbooks, I'm excited to have the opportunity to share this time with you this afternoon and share strategies for organizing your content at a chapter level in a way that defines your author style for content delivery. This session is being recorded, so all attendees have been muted upon entry to the webinar. We ask that you remain muted throughout the session to avoid introducing any feedback from background noise. I'll be answering questions at the end of the session, so please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box on the screen at any time during the presentation. Right, the content that I'm sharing with you today comes from the TAA publication, Writing and Developing Your College Textbook, a Comprehensive Guide. Third edition, authored by Mary Ellen Lepianka, Sean Wakely, and Stephen Gillen. Although full of great information and, as TAA's Council Vice President Kevin Patton noted, an essential tool for anyone interested in writing textbooks, we will be focusing our discussion today on organization strategies for chapter development rather than the entirety of the book. So, thinking about writing a textbook can be much like planning to climb a mountain. A daunting task that may be overwhelming and requires both endurance and strength before even getting started. But what if I told you that, like most major projects or journeys, the effectiveness of the whole is really defined by the quality of the small parts that get put together? Not exclusive of endurance and strength, there are other similar needs for both endeavors, such as perseverance, preparedness, goals, resources, and of course, a map. So, hopefully, in our time together, we'll give you a little bit of a map to developing your chapters. So, as we prepare to climb this mountain, we're going to focus on taking it one step at a time. Relating this analogy to textbook authoring, the steps include the development of chapters. This happens through carefully crafted headings specific to predefined topics that are thoroughly and thoughtfully enhanced by pairing content with feature strands to engage the reader and exercises within or at the end of the chapter to reinforce learning. Now, ultimately, this process organizes our material into an effective table of contents built from continually applying this cycle of steps until every chapter in our textbook is properly developed and placed in the book. So we're going to start with the idea of headings. Now, in chapter 9 of the book, Mary Ellen Lepianka stresses the need to take the time to get headings right. Specifically, she says, because headings have high visibility and because your textbook will be sold largely on the basis of its table of contents, it is worth whatever time it takes for you to get the organization and headings right. Now, before looking at headings within the chapters, you have likely taken time to outline your broad scope and sequence for the book itself, part of what we're not getting into today. You've identified parts and chapters as a foundation for moving forward and toward the headings and subheadings that is going to be outlining your content within each specific chapter. So, for definition, we're going to talk about the scope and sequence as referring to the range of topics you will cover and the order in which they are covered. When developing parts and chapters, you may take a progressive story like approach of chronological development, or you may have an analytical approach of classification or hierarchical development, or treat all topics equally in kind of a parallel fashion of horizontal development, structuring and organizing your content. Development of this scope and sequence relies on an ability to chunk information for desired learning outcomes associated with each part or chapter. So that chunking process continued into the chapters themselves in the form of headings and subheadings. However, instead of focusing on the learning objectives that you're looking at from the broad scope of parts and chapters, or the sequence of delivery of information associated with chunking those parts and chapters, the headings are going to chunk information in a way that is specifically functional for the reader. And these headings serve as an organizational tool that helps the reader understand how they will use the content, which follows, and how it's going to integrate into the rest of the content presented in that chapter or book. So, to further differentiate and connect content, subheadings are also used to build a structure. And typically, a maximum of 5 levels deep you will see in a textbook. So, done properly, headings are going to follow what we call the rule of two. So, the rule of two says if I have an A head that has B heads associated with it, there should be 2 or more B heads associated with that A head. And if I have a B head that has C heads, so a third level of headings, then there should be 2 or more C heads associated with that B head, and so on and so forth. So headings, in some kind of final thoughts here, should be straightforward and short. They're used to convey topical differentiations. So as we look at it, we want to focus on how the heading specifically serves the learner. How does it help them understand what is being conveyed in this section of the chapter? And depending on your goals and emphasis, you may order that content or identify content in different ways through your heading structure. There's no one right way to construct headings. You might consider using questions, though. The question and answer approach to heading development helps students connect content to specific learning objectives and can be useful in actually focusing the reader's attention as they read the narrative to connect back to the general question that the heading presented. So finally, some final thoughts here. The sequence and hierarchical leveling of the headings and subheadings can convey different meanings and importance to content. So as you chunk information into a heading structure, consider what connects best with the scope and the sequence of the project. Because our heading structure, ultimately in an expanded table of contents, provides that scaffold for the entire project. And as it structures the way that we deliver the narrative content and the other features of our chapters in the textbook as a whole, that organization can be completely different if we start with, let's say, in my line with computer programming, if I started with variables and looked at defining particular variables and gave the chapter heading variables and then broke down into other variables, independent or dependent or constants, and explored those things. Now I have given a level of priority to that variable, right? And the fact that things change. Whereas if I dedicated an A head, or I started with constants and then talked about things changing, I have focused the attention first and foremost on things staying the same. So, just again, a kind of off the cuff example there, but both are topics that need to make it into the programming discussion, whether I give them equal weight or I give them a structured heading to subheading relationship between them, because some people may say, well, constants are simply variables that don't change, right? Well, in the same light, variables are constants that do change. So our approach to sharing that information will change the way that that information is received and ultimately learned and applied from our student perspective. And that's the importance, is to serve the learner. So the second major part of chapter organization and development that we're going to look at today is that of topics. And topical development, according to our book here, refers to the amount of elaboration or the depth of coverage, number of subtopics, and number of words, and in printed form, the amount of space that we devote to a topic. So the time and effort that we spent talking about headings that you're going to spend developing your heading structure will ultimately guide the development of topics into written content. Again, why our order, our scope, and sequence matters. So more paragraphs should be contained within what we have designated to be bigger topics or higher level headings. So the A and B heads should have more paragraphs than, let's say, C and D heads that cover briefer or perhaps even lesser concepts, right? So if we're building that structure in a hierarchical fashion, then our lower level subheads are going to be more and more detail oriented and therefore have less explanation and narrative associated with them as we create that. So your specific discipline and subject matter is going to greatly influence the content and topics that are covered. So I'm not going to spend as much time on this section as the others that I do in our discussion today, but I do want to cover a few key points. So first, when you are developing your topics, it's important to begin each new topic with a thesis statement or a question. Okay, something in that first paragraph that triggers the reader to understand where are we going in this particular section of the chapter. And then promptly explain why that topic was worthy of inclusion. Why did you put a particular heading dedicated to this particular topic in this part of the book? Okay, so begin with a thesis or question and then explain your reasoning why it's worth including there. Avoid an imbalance though. Okay, inconsistency in topical development, underdevelopment of abstract ideas, and unsupported claims can all damage the learner's ability to receive the information. Underdeveloped topics are going to leave learners without adequate coverage of the topic, and that's flat out problematic in a classroom setting. Whereas overdeveloped topics may have readers tempted to just skip past, right? Skip over the passages once they feel like they've achieved comprehension on the subject matter. So maintaining a balance and consistency in your topical development can help you avoid either potential issue in your textbook. And as you develop topics, you can cluster your ideas into meaningful chunks. So we've already talked about this idea of chunking content a couple times, but when you put it together and you organize sections for natural and coherent transition, you are avoiding topics that don't have reference to other topics in your book. You're cross-referencing to previous chapters, but when you're doing that, be careful to refer only backwards as opposed to forecasting forwards. Let your future revisiting of the topic refer back to where it was introduced previously, but don't promise the reader, we'll get to this in chapter 8. Okay, while we're over here in chapter 2. Focus on the subject and the headings that you have in place for the topics in that particular section or chapter. And then make clear transitions from one section to another, whether that is going from an A head to a B head in where you are saying, well, let's delve into this further. Let's talk about this topic a little more in detail. Or it's shifting gears completely. Now that we have an understanding of variables, let's talk about a related topic of constants, right? So now we have that natural and coherent transition of ending the one section and beginning the next, all within the same chapter structure. Okay, so some of the fun parts And these last two I kind of broke out into features and exercises, but you may consider them as a broad term of features because exercises really do fall under that category of features. And as I reviewed the features and the feature strands that were introduced in writing and developing your college textbook in preparation for this webinar today, I looked at these features and I said, which ones are really kind of narrative alternatives? Which are features that are adding to the content versus which are features that engage the learner at a level that they are, interacting. And then at that point, I'm considering it more of an exercise, a workload on the part of the reader rather than simply a feature or a component of the authorship or the manuscript itself. So regularly occurring pedagogical features that we find within the body of each chapter, we will often call feature strands. Okay, and these feature strands are there with purpose or should be. So anything that you put into your chapter should have a reason for being there. And that reason really should be to contribute to the educational value and the visual appeal of your textbook. So, beyond the narrative, we have certain elements of the page structure or of the chapter design that we're going to call feature strands that have both educational value and visual appeal. Now, as I say that, that's generally the intent of the author. And yet, having been a teacher for years and worked with hundreds of students, I know that students tend to fall into one of two camps. They either want to go to those feature strands and pull all of the information that they can, thinking, well, that's the highlighted stuff. That's the information that must be most important. Or they go, that's fluff. That's extra filler on the page. And what I need to focus on is the narrative. And it really depends on whether or not they like to read, I think. But, those features should work with the narrative to add educational value and visual appeal to your textbook. So, what are some of those features? Well, the first one is what we call a scenario or a vignette. Okay, scenarios and vignettes are brief descriptions of real life situations. Now, a scenario must link directly to the content in the chapter introduction or the first A-head section. Okay, so that introductory paragraph that's setting the stage for the entire chapter content is where we find a scenario that is set up. And again, that's a brief description of a real life situation. So that might be, an account of a situation that occurred. That might be an actual, stolen from the news sort of, situation. It may be dialogue that sets up a discussion later in the chapter, or some sort of story problem. So, whatever that is, we're setting the stage for how the educational learning that's taking place in this chapter is going to be related to that scenario. We want to make sure that there is a link to the content that's in the chapter. We also might decide to use a vignette. And a vignette is basically a scenario, but instead of being the setup for the chapter, it could be anywhere within the relevant text. So we might think of this as, an aside. We have been talking about this, and now let me tell you a story about this particular situation where this can be applied. So when we have embedded those scenarios, whichever term you want to use, vignette is the official term for something that's embedded in the relevant text that is providing that scenario or story or real life situation to come from. Now, if you want to take your scenario or vignette up a level, you want to add some educational value and pedagogical value to your chapter, end that scenario or vignette with a question to the reader. Okay, so if you're using a scenario as a chapter opener, which is where it's best used, or a vignette somewhere in the narrative, finish up that story, give them that information, and then ask them a question that has them evaluate that a little closer. Yeah, and you can do it immediately at the end of the scenario, at the end of the vignette, or for scenarios when you have not yet done the teaching, you might choose to wait until the end of the chapter. So introduce the chapter with a scenario, run through your teaching of the related concepts associated with that scenario, tying back wherever you can in terms of the link, and then revisit. So let's go back to our situation at the beginning of the chapter. What do you think should happen now that you have this set of knowledge that you've developed throughout the readings? So, vignettes, you might ask the question kind of right away. Scenarios, if you want to do it more as a pre-test, what's your consideration here? Now that you have this knowledge, let's revisit it at the end of the chapter as well. A lot of different ways that we can work that feature strand of scenario or vignette into our chapter structure. Now, an epigram is usually used at the chapter opener. You might see it integrated within the narrative, but it's a brief attributed quotation. So, yeah, this one that I've got as an example, the important thing is to be able at any moment to sacrifice what we are for what we could become. Charles Dubois. So, that quotation there, to start off a chapter again is there to set the stage. It's to engage with the reader on an emotional level. It's, giving them something to connect to. Now, don't simply randomly pick quotes and add them to your textbook chapters to have an additional feature. Make sure that there's an intentional use of it. And when we talk about feature strands, and I don't think I mentioned this a moment ago, so it's worth bringing up at this point, it is something that if you can create that strand and decide deliberately in your large plan for the textbook beyond this single chapter that we're focused on right now, a consistent implementation, even though it's going to be different based off of content, but a consistent implementation of that feature strand so that the reader gets used to seeing it. You know, each chapter starts with a scenario, or each chapter starts with an epigram. Now we have that consistency to the structure of our overall manuscript that makes it easy to expect and then to look for what's different and to say, okay, so last chapter I had to think on this quote. This chapter I'm thinking on this quote, and I'm framing my learning for the chapter based off of what has been introduced in that epigram. Okay, so case studies. Case studies is probably one of the more commonly used feature strands, and they can also be somewhat difficult to produce. The best cases are going to be real and situational. Okay, so they provide an in-depth analysis of some example or application. And, ideally, if you were in particularly a clinical type discipline where you can, gather cases and, get permission to use that information in your books, wonderful. You now have a set of, situations that you can take your, reader further into the process, right? Let's look at this case. Make sure, however, that your case is, like I said, real and situational is the ideal. So, but regardless of whether they have been created for the purpose of the textbook or they are truly, real, they should have accurate reportage. So the information that's in the case should be realistic, even if it's a fictional case. And then again, for that pedagogical value, we want to end the case study with questions for the reader. So case studies, you'll find at the beginning, you'll find at the end, you'll find as interior features. Generally, when they're used as interior features in a chapter, they're kind of offset maybe, highlighted in a particular box area on the page, or something to give a definition to them, but they invite reflection. They invite application of the concepts from the chapter in which they are embedded. And they invite additional evaluation of the subject matter of the chapter in a real world situation. They take us from simply reading and theoretically absorbing information and knowledge that's being provided in the chapter to an actual mindset and processing of what would I do? If I were faced with this situation, what would I do? So those questions can draw out. Or maybe it's not even what would I do, maybe it's what happened here. Okay, let's examine this. Let's take a forensic or a CSI type perspective and analyze the information that's been presented. What went wrong? What went right? Right? And to take that objective approach. So, a lot of different ways that case studies can be incorporated, particularly when we pair it with pedagogically sound, intentional questions for the reader at the end. Now, profiles. Profiles sometimes get confused with case studies. And yeah, the two might visually, in terms of the feature strand on a page, appear the same. And, for some people, a profile may be considered a case study, right? I'm looking at this particular individual, or this particular business or situation. So, the again, we want, like case studies, to explore the topic in greater depth through an in-depth description of something. Now, in this case, where profiles are different, is profiles tend to be the example. They're that best case. They're the ideal. They're the business that's been growing, tremendously over the past 10 years, and we want to look at them with an in-depth description of what they're doing right so that we can support why we're teaching you how to do this from a business perspective, right? So they're best used as interior features within the chapter or as chapter openers to again establish the purpose behind the content that's in the narrative from that chapter. So we are learning to, use Twitter in this chapter for social media marketing, right? Here is how the, greatest influencers on Twitter have been, accomplishing this, and the way that they have approached their daily interaction with Twitter users, over the last 10 years, right? So now we have a profile that is, again, an objective viewpoint, but giving us an in-depth look at a person or a company or some example that we want to follow. Not necessarily that, what went wrong here approach that might be in a case study that we talked about earlier. Okay. Primary sources are another feature strand. So, this would be excerpts from a document, first person accounts, exhibit of evidence, or passage from literature. And the challenge for using primary sources really is permissioning. And we have a whole other book on rights clearance and permissions. Thank you, Steve Gillen. But despite those permission issues that may cause pause for some people, in humanities disciplines especially, that primary source material is all but indispensable, and it can be built into regular chapter features. So you might, some examples from our writing and developing your college textbook, is, maybe you call it snapshots of the past, right? And that becomes something that there's a different snapshot of the past in each chapter, and it becomes that, ongoing feature strand. Or field notes, if maybe you're in, a biology or a chemistry discipline, right? Or even, clinical social work. Maybe field notes becomes now that, feature strand that is giving us primary source real information, that again we need permissions, and to cover that, but something else that adds to the learning environment and the teaching that we're trying to convey through that chapter material. So another example was teacher talk. And you could come up with your own catchy name or feature strand title to work through based off of what your discipline is and the primary source information that you want to share. But imagine an art class that you weren't looking at original pieces of art and it was all theoretical discussion, right? As opposed to, I'm sure we can all recognize the picture on the screen there, which is being used under Creative Commons licensing. So, um, thematic boxes. Again, these are going to be things possibly taken from the news. They tie in to whatever it is that we're teaching in the narrative. Every one of these feature strands has got that same underlying reason for being there. So content in thematic boxes should reinforce rather than substitute the narrative content through a description of an event or hot topics in the particular field of study. I know that there were an awful lot of books last year that were being updated with COVID-19 information, right? So maybe we can't dedicate an entire chapter to that yet because the understanding isn't there and the time isn't there to really develop and accurately educate. But that can certainly make its way into a thematic box, as a feature strand within the chapter to at least say, hey, we're keeping up with stuff. We know this event's happening, but the book's going to print. So, we have what information we have, but that's ever changing at this point. And certainly in my discipline of computer technology, there are, advancements every day and changes within that discipline that, again, this is a way to integrate that to keep yourself current as a textbook author, but at the same time, not to continually be rewriting all of the core narrative or reworking your entire table of contents simply because something new came into the news or into the field. Okay, so you might have noticed that there are some items that you would consider, feature strands that are missing at this point that you may have thought, that should have been in my features list. And again, I took that overall kind of list of features and I separated out this group that I'm going to call exercises. And I did that because I want to look at the things that are not really consumed but more engaged with by the learners. So, that's how I'm distinguishing features from exercises from a terminology perspective. So, exercises here are going to have a more interactive approach. Now, that's not to say that some of these exercises you can't simply deliver as part of your content and write in a way that you're not looking for the interaction, or maybe you leave it up to the instructor to ultimately build an interactive component to it. But again, like with the case studies, which I maybe could have moved over to exercises, particularly when we add in those questions at the end. Well, what would you have done, or where do you see problems in this situation? So from this perspective, we're focusing these last few items that we're going to talk about today on that idea of an interactive approach to development. So the first is going to be that of debate. So, a debate certainly can be presented as a narrative. It's something that, we could describe how, the last vice presidential debate happen and what the opposing views were and so forth. Whereas if we convert that more to an interactive exercise, what we're doing is we're instead presenting the opposing mindsets, the opposing views, and we're forcing them to take a side, and we're expecting those students to defend a particular position. And maybe we tie that into, well, let's, go over here and, take a would you rather type vote on Kahoot or something, an electronic tool like that. or maybe we are looking at an active discussion, or we're engaging in a discussion board in an online class environment, right? But what we have done is set the stage for there's no right answer necessarily, right? So that's the big thing about a debate is we have opposing viewpoints, but it's up to the individual to decide and defend which perspective they feel is the right one. So, if you have those types of hot topics, the, ones that, really can become controversial discussions and so forth in your classroom environment and your discipline, you know, debate is probably a feature strand that you're going to want to work into your textbook narrative and as a feature strand within each of the chapters to really engage the readers in the subject matter that's being presented. Now, my discipline uses this particular form of exercise quite frequently. Modeling or the how to approach to things. And we've got an entire series of how to elements that are going to be coming into our virtual conference this June, thanks to Maureen's efforts. But, as a computer instructor, I teach people, well, here is how you use Excel. Here is what a cell is. Here is how we structure a formula. Now let's type a formula. Now let's see the results of that formula. And we're working through the steps logically of the how to make this happen so that hopefully ultimately when they're faced with a need for that particular process, they can implement it. So, the how to that I have here on the screen is an example, how to change engine oil in a few easy steps, right? So that, also could be in a textbook for, mechanics classes. So application or demonstration of the desired behavior. So we don't want to throw in, well, maybe you do it this way and then let's find out what went wrong over there. We want to show them the right way, give them the, desired behavior, the desired practice or desired principle shown in action. These how-to features, when they're put in place within the chapter, become the kind of follow along teaching moment, guided instruction, where when they fall at the end of a chapter, they can become assessment exercises. They can also be additional resources for the teacher to use as other examples to teach from. But quite frequently will end up being that assessment tool at the end of the material. Reflections or rating forms. We are definitely in a society that likes to share their opinion, whether it's voting for the next American Idol or it's, providing the review on the Amazon purchase they made last week, right? So this is something that, again, engages the learner in the process. And, when we ask for their personal experience or their personal response, the goal of a reflection is to get that engagement, to have them not only have read the content, ideally, or listen to the teacher provide the information that came from the chapter materials, but rather to then take that subject, what their prior knowledge is, their own thought processes, their effective responses, and to engage with the subject matter and to add their contribution to it. What do I think now that I've learned this? And to take that information and give it back in a way that now allows the instructor the opportunity to evaluate, truly, did they understand this, or did they understand this in the way that I wanted them to, or did they simply read and maybe got the right answers on the quiz, perhaps by luck of the draw. So, reflection gives an opportunity for a much more personal interaction with the student when that's incorporated into the chapter content as a feature strand. Critical thinking exercises. We see these a lot, particularly as end of chapter items. But again, this is something that maybe we incorporate in other places in the chapter. Maybe you have a reflection, and then you ask them, okay, so now that you have digested the information and you have shared back your understanding of that information, let's take this up a level, right? Let's think about how we might apply this to a different situation, right? And now we can make it interactive. We can encourage higher levels of cognitive functioning in the students, by giving them a problem to solve. Um, Again, in my discipline, we have the how-to models, and we use that kind of, almost give it back to us in the form of reflection, even though it's not the reflection type questions I was just mentioning, but more so, okay, here's a new scenario, follow the same steps to get the right result for this new scenario. And then we take it another level with the critical thinking exercises to say, okay, I'm not going to give you the steps. I'm going to give you the expected outcome. Now, how are you going to use the steps that you've learned that have been modeled to you, that you have reflected by doing other exercises that use the same exact steps? How are you going to alter those steps to produce this result that I need while applying the information that you had presented to you in the chapter, right? So that's where our critical thinking exercises are taking us, at a different level of cognitive functioning and an expectation of the students to not only have read and consumed, but now to be converting that knowledge into something that they can apply to a given scenario. And last but not least, in the exercise realm, and I see more of this perhaps because of the discipline I'm in, but I feel like it's a trend across our disciplines at this point, that we're seeing more and more supplemental systems and opportunities for engagement in, videos from the author, or interactive exercises, or global debates, or other forms of supplemental material that connects back to the subject matter that we're teaching. And wherever we can find a way to take our print or even ebook, whichever we're working with, material, and reference those additional resources, we tie that in and we expand the level of education that we can provide to the students that maybe doesn't fit within the page count that we're bound to in the book, right? So, whether we as authors produce that content or our publishers produce that content or hire people to produce that content, knowing that content exists and what is beneficial for our users at the time that we're authoring the chapters gives us a way to encourage engagement with that, at a higher level than what they may have, otherwise adopted. A good way that is, available to tie in the supplements that has been used for years is particularly instructor editions, right? So here is the information where you can find additional resources, if you want, 12 other critical thinking exercises that I just didn't have room to put in the end of the chapter here, right? So we often, historically in textbook publishing, have provided that, as additional supplements for the instructor. But now we're seeing a whole market, whether it's readers, magazines, videos, software, etc., that are being provided direct to the student as well. So, considering how we can connect those independent pieces into a holistic learning experience for our students and for our readers of our textbooks is something that as authors right now in 2021, we need to be considering, as we author our chapters, as we organize our headings, as we, build our feature strands into the material that we're producing. Which means if everything's done right, Features are going to increase the saleability of your textbook. It's going to also increase the educational value for the readers, which should be first and foremost on the agenda. But selling the books is a good thing too. So be sure to choose wisely, to consider the choices of all of these different things that we've listed as features or exercises. And know first and foremost, you can't integrate all of them, at least successfully. You can put them all in there, but you're not going to do well putting all of them in there, right? So look at which, first and foremost, address the needs of the students that you are trying to serve. Then look at the ones that fit your subject. What's being used in other books in your discipline? What's not being used and might be effective, right? What expresses your key themes? Your book is unique in the market in some way, shape, or form. What is the key theme and how can it best be conveyed through one of these feature strands? What's relevant to your audience? Again, those student needs and connecting the dots to that, is going to be your target audience. The instructors are also part of your audience. So what's going to be a way that they can teach and use those features as opposed to it just being something that was in the book that we went past because it didn't add value to my teaching environment. Now, and what can be provided systematically throughout the work. What can be systematically applied? You know, the feature strands truly become strands when you see it first in chapter one, you see it every chapter thereafter until you get to the end. And you have that consistency without building monotony. Which is the balance there, right? So how do I make sure that I am delivering consistency of this feature while making sure that each and every time that feature is used, it has a purpose within the chapter that it's used in? And the secret to that is that you don't use it where it doesn't fit. So if chapter 6 doesn't have a case study because there wasn't a case study appropriate for it, you don't try to make a square peg fit in a round hole just to make it part of the chapter because every other chapter had one. You find a way to use it where it's going to best serve the audience, and you leave it out if it doesn't, or if you can't find something that's going to fit where you need it to be. All right, so I'm going to circle back around to our big picture that we started with, and then I'll, open up with some questions here at the end. I see that we're doing okay on time here at 2:47, so should leave about 10 minutes for Q&A. But with all of the pieces, headings, topics, features, and exercises assembled successfully for one chapter, a single chapter, you basically rinse and repeat. You apply that same process to the next chapter and the next one after that until all of the topics have been adequately covered in the proper order for your textbook to be published and to successfully sell. Now, again, this information was adapted from the TAA publication, Writing and Developing Your College Textbook, a Comprehensive Guide by Mary Ellen Lepianka, Sean Wakely, and Stephen Gillen. And that is available through our TAA online store at taaonline.net/store in both ebook and print versions. So if you don't already have a copy, I do recommend visiting the store and getting yours today. But I appreciate you letting me share some of this with you, and I continue to learn from these authors that have come before me. And thank you for joining me in this presentation. So I'm going to try to respond to some questions that may have been submitted. If you do have questions at this point, please enter them in the questions box. And let me see if I can get over to that area in GoToWebinar without losing the connection here. So, all right, at this point, I don't see any questions. So anybody that would like to add in there, please feel free to do so. I got a comment that says, great webinar, thank you, I appreciate that. Another thank you. You're welcome. I do appreciate you being here today. And I do think someone said that they won't write a textbook, but a normal academic book. Thought this workshop can be useful. I do agree. Any book is still going to have that kind of overall structure to it, how you apply these principles and what you use. If you don't have the pedagogical elements, that a textbook would have, that's okay as well. Take from this what you can get, and I appreciate you joining us this afternoon. Um, is there a recommended length of time that should be dedicated to write each chapter? Uh, One of my wife's old professors used to say about writing papers, how long does it need to be would be a common question they'd get, and their answer was as long as a piece of string, as long as it needs to be. Yeah, I kind of take that. My approach to things is really that I front load my investment of time, meaning that where I can build systems and structure to things, where I can have a nice detailed table of contents with all of my headings and subheadings defined, then the narrative part of it tends to go much, much faster. Whereas if I'm trying to figure out all of the structural elements at the same time that I'm trying to write the narrative, it can be quite time consuming. So if you want to abbreviate that time, not that I have an answer for what the recommended length of time should be, but if you want to abbreviate that time, you might want to take the approach of having almost a template you can fill in. And again, recognizing that sometimes you just take a piece out or you add a piece as necessary for the things that you've got. So, yeah, thank you for the ideas. Thank yous. Fantastic presentation. Thank you. Um, Please tell us if the topic of headings is explained in details in Ms. Lipyanka's book. Otherwise, what resources would you recommend to learn more about headings, various levels? Are those the same as in the APA guide? So yes, chapter 9 of the book, which I do have here, talks about the organization of table of contents, writing good titles. It also then goes into determining levels of headings, crafting headings, the wording, what they really mean, how many you should have. Gives some nice comparison of different structures. I talked earlier about the idea of what you put the priority on, and then goes into the topical development. So, while it doesn't get into specifics necessarily of formatting, because style guides like APA and so forth will vary based off of your projects, it does give us kind of the ideas of how do I formulate those headings and make them, applicable to my writing project. Right, for someone in the initial stages of drafting and writing, do you recommend working with a developmental editor? I have found great benefit to working with developmental editors. And working with traditional publishers on the different textbook projects that I have done. The developmental editor has been assigned to me, but that also helps keep you focused. It helps, see where things really don't fit that you felt like, well, I really wanted to talk about this particular topic. Yes, but it doesn't belong in this book. So developmental editors will help you get your ideas in an organized and manageable way that it ultimately is not too much or too little for the book. I talked earlier in the presentation about overdeveloping or underdeveloping topics, and that being a problem in either way. So the developmental editor is that person who takes that vantage for your project, and I would certainly recommend working with them earlier than later. Copy editing, save that for the end, but developmental is in that development process. It's in that time where your ideas are raw and we want to see what actually works where within the book. So, most definitely in the drafting and writing stage, I would recommend working with a developmental editor. They can also, gut check you a little later if you went off course, which is why in the writing stage, it's worth checking in with them again to make sure that you didn't, go astray, because they can, again, take that objective perspective that you get lost in when you're doing the actual writing. So. All right. This webinar has been very informative. I'm resisting the urge to rewrite my recent book being published in June. Great information to next time. Thank you. And again, awesome. Thank you. So I appreciate all of the positive feedback. If there are any other questions, go ahead and add them to the queue at this time. Otherwise, I do hope that you all enjoyed it and appreciate you completing the survey. And if you don't have a copy of Mary Ellen, Sean, and Stephen's book, it is definitely one I'm glad to have on my bookshelf and would encourage you getting a copy for your own benefits. So. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions coming in at this point. So the last thing I'll close with, this is the last of our scheduled spring webinar series. However, our virtual conference is coming up this June. Early registration is open for that event, and lots of great sessions are going to be held during that event. So please visit taaonline.net and check out the conference information and get yourself registered for some wonderful learning next, 2 months from now. All right. Thanks everyone for joining me and have a great day.